Well, good morning, everyone.
Good morning.
Glad to have you here in our Bible class hour as we are moving through our study of the book of John, going further into John chapter 2. Have a really great set of scriptures that we're going to study today that will really find a lot of application in some of the difficulties that we're facing presently with things going on in the brotherhood, especially when it comes to means and modes of evangelism and learning directly from Jesus on how we are, in fact, able to handle things if necessary. But before moving into that, one thing that I forgot to mention from last week about the events here in chapter 2, the wedding feast in Cana, and the changing of water into wine, and that so as we're mentioning, there are extra things that these biblical accounts are able to help us answer and in fact be able to deal with. And even though those are in there, not necessarily the whole point of what the context is dealing with, we still can use them for these type of benefits. Now, one thing that is very good about this event and this recording of this event is that it helps us to prove the fact that there are other false gospel accounts out there. And particularly with what's happening here in John 2, the wedding feast at Cana. Does anybody know where I'm going? By your own studies and own interactions with people.
The Bible.
No.
What was the question?
Hold on.
Sorry.
Is there a doctrine that says Jesus did miracles as a kid?
Okay. So it's not doctrine. Yeah, doctrine being a teaching. So yes, you're right. But where does that come from? All right. Well, that's good. That's good that you knew that. There is a false gospel out there entitled the Gospel of Thomas. And it's not even included in the Roman Catholic's Bible as being part of the Apocrypha. They don't even recognize it. But does not change the fact that it's still out there. People pick it up, and some individuals consider it as being a accurate portrayal or something that would go along with what the gospel accounts that we have are actually presenting. And in fact, the Quran, the Muslims' Bible, actually quotes from this fake gospel in their writings about who Jesus supposedly was. Now, the problem with that is the way that they quote it and the way that they present it, which is, I've read some of the Gospel of Thomas, and it's pretty accurate as to what they are doing in the presentation of Jesus as a child. They present him as a spoiled brat, ultimately, in this false gospel. So that's point number one as to why this is not a true gospel account. But the other element is that inside of this gospel account, and it's what the Quran actually quotes, is that Jesus is involved in performing miracles as a child. And that one in particular was that he was down by a river and he was making these models of birds out of clay. Some boys came along and were picking at him, and he turned the clay birds into real birds, and can't remember if he had them attack the other children or not, but there's something in that. But how does the Gospel of John, as we're studying here, go against what that record would try to proclaim? How would you be able to prove which one's accurate and which one's not? Or how would you even begin to set the foundation that there's a problem?
Well, there's no recording of it.
Okay, there's no recording of that.
Verse 11.
All right. What were you going to say, Adrian?
Nothing. He was going to hit me with
Oh,
something.
okay, all right. Okay, all right. No, that's good enough. That's good. All right, so then Jordan brings up John 2:11. We know John's record is true. And John states about this event at the wedding feast of Cana, this beginning of miracles did Jesus in Cana of Galilee. This discredits and disproves this. So when we're dealing with people, and you got to be aware of this stuff. This stuff is out there. And that there are people that will pick this up and they'll try to hold on to it as a credible source. But if we're actually going to go with what we know is true, there cannot be any inconsistencies. There can't be any contradictions. So either this is the beginning of his miracles, or this is what's actually going on. So that's just a little side element of another thing that we're thinking about, or can be presented and dealt with when we're considering John chapter 2 here, and how it helps further prove the legitimacy of the record that we have against false records that are out here. So, any other thoughts, questions on that? All right.
Is verse 4 would be included in that too, where it says, "My hour has not yet come"?
So when we're dealing with that phrase, as we're considering it through even our Matthew study and the rest of John's gospel that we're going to study, that is going to have a continuous theme and connection specifically with his crucifixion. So as we have him doing certain things, and it's going to be said that they took hold of him to try to destroy him or try to kill him, that phrase is going to come back in, that he slipped out amongst them because his hour was not yet.
I do remember it now being, it'll pop up a few
Right.
times.
Yeah. So good question. But then also, so here but with gospel, it's with the Gospel of Thomas. If that were true, then we would have the first recorded event of trap shooting, clay pigeons. Thought that was good. All right. So moving on. John chapter 2, verses 12 through 17. And that we have been recorded in the same context with the marriage feast at Cana. Then moving on to the cleansing of the temple, and that also being a representation, a manifestation of the fullness of God. The things that John is recording by divine inspiration are done on purpose. There's a reason for this. And that, as we've been studying, one of the main goals or the thrust of what we are studying about as John is recording it, John 1:14 and also 16, the Word was made flesh, dwelt among us, and we beheld His glory. The glory is of the only begotten of the Father, full of grace and truth. And we made mention of the fact that this fullness, as it's mentioned in verse 16, and of His fullness have we all received, and grace for grace. More of this is going to be on display. This fullness of character, of attitude, of behavior, and specifically the fullness of truth is going to be on display with the cleansing of the temple. All right, so we're going to make connection between the temple event, the wedding feast event. So don't lose track of where we've been. So verse 12. After this, so here's continuation of time. After this, he went down to Capernaum, he and his mother and his brethren and his disciples, and they continued there not many days. If you remember from our Matthew study, Capernaum becomes a headquarters of sorts for Jesus' work. And the Jews' Passover was at hand, and Jesus went up to Jerusalem. John is helping us to keep time in the recognition and the establishment of these days, but specifically when it comes to his recordings of Passovers. John is going to give us records of this is going on at this Passover, this is going on at the next Passover, and then you come to another Passover. Now, what's the significance of Passover when it comes to keeping time for the Jews?
Well, it's the main event of the year.
Uh-huh.
So we have a yearly count going on.
Okay, that's all right. Got a huge event on their calendar. Where is it set on their calendar?
Where's it set?
Yeah.
Easter.
No.
Is it the
Okay, very good. The Passover, the month of Passover, is the beginning of their year. So John is recording this. The Jews' Passover is at hand. We're at the start of a new year. And this event is taking place. So we have that element of time helping us here. But then, if you notice, I have boxed around here, John uses a very interesting phrase when he's talking about the Passover. and that he references it as the Jews' Passover. What's significant about that?
It's a separation.
All right, and how would you flesh that out? You're right.
Well, he would write this after Christianity has been established.
Okay.
So it's with respect to the way that it was.
Okay.
And it's no longer.
Okay. All right, that's good. That John is writing this in a perspective of looking backwards. He's recording past events so that when he's writing about this event in the time frame in which it was going on, it would be in force. But from the vantage point where he is, Judaism's been done away with. Now we're in Christianity. Now we're under the New Testament system. So we're looking back at it from this standpoint of the Jews' Passover. Okay, so that's one. But there's another.
Would it be, since Jesus is our Passover, the Passover lamb?
That would tack on to
Yeah,
what your mom
okay.
said.
What's the question?
This significance of John recording the identification of the Passover as being the Jews' Passover. And to give you a hint, so as Jamie was saying, John is in the future looking back. This has been removed, no longer in force, but it also has some significance in the time that Jesus is actually alive.
Will now be written to everybody,
Mm-hmm.
Gentiles,
Mm-hmm.
so that I don't know.
Okay, that's all right.
Isn't that it wasn't God's Passover, it was the Jews who...
Say it louder so they can hear you in the back.
It wasn't God's Passover, it was the Jews who took it and turned it into what they wanted.
All right. So even during this time, and John writing of this like this, he is giving insight and looking into the separation that is already transpiring between what is God's and what man is taking for himself. Now we can find this being illustrated Exodus 12:11 and also Leviticus 23:5. Here we have the establishment. Exodus 12 is the establishment of the Passover. And notice how it's characterized. And thus shall ye eat it with your loins girded, your shoes on your feet, your staff in your hand, and ye shall eat in haste. It is the Lord's Passover. It's not the Jews. And then even Leviticus, when you have them reestablishing further, writing it down inside of their code. In the 14th day of the first month at even is the Lord's Passover. So this terminology by John suggests, even at this point, the transition from what is God's to what the Jews have now taken for themselves and they've corrupted. What you're doing, this isn't the Lord's. This really is yours. You have inserted your own traditions into this, Matthew chapter 15. And by inserting your own traditions, you are ignoring and neglecting, forsaking the commandments of God. So these things were no longer the Lord's. The Pharisees and the Sadducees had hijacked even the Passover. Made it theirs. Yes?
We know that through the text, specifically what they were doing, the Pharisees and the Sadducees, that we would know that to make that connection.
It will come from the other gospel accounts, and that specifically of Matthew 23, where Jesus is going through and he's giving the list of the hypocrisies of the Jewish leaders. And even in this text, with what we're fixing to see with the cleansing of the temple, Jesus makes an accusation to them about what they've done to the system. You've made it a den of thieves.
So within that is inclusive of the Passover, and we can extrapolate it.
Yes, yeah.
Okay.
My house is supposed to be a house of prayer, but you've made it a den of thieves. You've made it just like a common marketplace. And it wasn't supposed to be that. So go ahead.
Just those 2-3 minor sayings, we can get that in the text and infer that right there.
Well, as you go back and you start considering, like, for example, what Israel did to the Sabbath day, and that what you're finding is when you start polluting, when you start manipulating God's manner of worship, which is going to be one of our points of application, when you start perverting God's way of worship, then that perverts how you live. To where what we're seeing going on here on the Passover time would also be taking place on the Day of Atonement. It's not just a Passover thing. It's any time that these individuals will be coming together. It's like Eli's 2 sons and how that they were supposed to go in and take of the sacrifice, but they're supposed to take certain sections. But they had made a 3-pronged hook to where when they went in and took of the sacrifice, they took more than what they were supposed to. And that's part of it. That's a daily. There's a morning sacrifice and an evening sacrifice. And those were the kind of things that were going on even under the Old Testament system. And that even as we're discussing the Passover, those different type of elements are coming in as well. Just the greediness, the covetousness that would go along with what we're seeing with the buying and selling of the elements. So yeah, it bleeds, though it's not specifically mentioned. All right, so good question. All right, anything else? Okay. All right, so going to our map, because we're wanting to make sure that we're remembering what's taking place within these days that we're talking about. Nazareth to Bethsaida, Bethsaida to Cana. Now we're going from Cana back to Capernaum. A lot of back and forth that's happening here. But up to this point, still not made our way to Jerusalem. And it's only because of the time of Passover that Jesus goes down to Jerusalem, because that's the command of God, so rightfully so. But as we finish reading this event, we're going to find, where does Jesus immediately go back to? Does he stay in Jerusalem? No, he heads right back up into Galilee. So the only reason why he's coming into Jerusalem is for worship. He has no intention of staying there. And no real intention of just, okay, we're going to set up camp here. It's all about moving back here. So we moved from Capernaum down to Jerusalem. Now, just to test your memory here from our Matthew studies, why did I choose this map? Now, all of this is visual aid to help us to understand there's a lot of distance that's being covered from Capernaum and Jerusalem. And that we need to be aware of where things are on maps.
We walked through Samaria.
Oh, huh?
We walked through Samaria.
Okay.
Going around.
All right. So the reason why I chose this map is because it shows the 2 routes. If you remember from our Matthew study, it specifically mentioned that Jesus on his travels purposefully went through Samaria. And that's recorded because the habit is you don't go through Samaria. Samaria is bad. You come down, you cross over Jordan, you travel down, then you cross over Jordan again. Then you come into Jerusalem. And that just shows you how despised this area was. Now, if you think about it, during this time frame, I know I've already asked this question, and nobody's played it. Oregon Trail? Nope. You guys played Oregon Trail? The Oregon Trail? No way. Man, what was your childhood? If you know anything from playing the Oregon Trail, fording a river is not what you want to do. If you can find a bridge or some type of way of landmass to get over a river, you want to do that. This is treacherous, especially if you're traveling with a family, if you're traveling with livestock, and you're crossing a river twice. you are upping your percentage that something bad is going to happen. But they were willing to risk that just so as not to go through Samaria. That tells you how bad it is. Go ahead.
I was going to ask, is Samaria just Pablo of the world, or is it just because of their pride that they're doing stuff?
No, it's because during the captivity, the way the Samaritans came about were Israelites, Jews that were taken captive, and they were intermingled with foreign people, and they polluted themselves through that way.
Okay.
And to the degree, like that division became so strong that the Samaritans actually established their own form of religion, and they made their own copies of the scriptures to build themselves up as being superior over the rest of the Jews.
Which would be the Gospel of Thomas?
No, probably not. No, that's definitely not going to be in that. So here's where we're going. Capernaum, down here to Jerusalem, and that for the observance of this feast day. Now, here's where we're going to spend the rest of our time. And found in the temple those that sold oxen and sheep and doves and the changers of money sitting. And when he had made a scourge of small cords, he drove them all out of the temple, and the sheep and the oxen, and poured out the changers' money, and overthrew the tables, and said unto them that sold doves, Take these things hence, make not my Father's house an house of merchandise. And his disciples remembered that it was written, The zeal of thine house hath eaten me up. Now again, remember from our Matthew study, these money changers were allowed to be there. Everyone during this time frame, as you're coming in to bring your sacrifices, you're also paying the temple tax. And the temple tax was paid under the Jewish shekel. That's Exodus chapter 30, verses 11 through 16. But Israel is under Roman rule. And so you have Roman currency. All right? What we're going to have to do is we're going to change this Roman denarii into a Jewish shekel and give that over into the temple. So this is a needed expedient that's taking place here. But the problem is that, like with our currency today, you travel from the United States, you go over into Europe, you have to change your American dollar into the garbage euro. But if you're going to do that, you have to pay extra for the process. Deuteronomy 20, or 23 and verse 20, says that you're not charging usury of your brethren. You're not charging interest. And that's what these individuals are doing here. Okay, we're going to change your money over, but there's an extra charge with it for us actually making that exchange. You don't do that. And especially with what we're doing here, we're coming to worship. And if I am making this long journey from Capernaum down here to Jerusalem, I'm going to be stretched already. And now you're just wanting to nickel and dime me so that I can go to worship. Not supposed to be doing that. But then also you have within it the element that though this is a necessary process, if you're coming from a long journey and you don't want to bring your animals, you sell your sacrifice at home, you bring that money with you to Jerusalem, buy your animal in Jerusalem. So you got to have a place to buy and sell. According to Jewish tradition, all of this started, the temple sat in Jerusalem on about a 15 to 20 acre lot. The way this started was that this started out on the outskirts of that acreage. But then as time went on, it kept moving closer and closer and closer to the temple proper. To where here we have people coming to worship and you've got animals running around. You got all this hustle and bustle of a marketplace in the place where you're supposed to be focusing and meditating on what it is that you're doing. And that's not supposed to be there. So Jesus is involved in driving that out. So here's a good example of how an expedient can become a hindrance. They were now abusing it and growing beyond its use. To where before we're using, okay, this just as a necessary thing. Now we're taking this necessary thing and we're abusing it for our own gain and for our own purposes. And that the real purpose of the temple was lost entirely. Thus, with the statement that Jesus makes, you've made it a den of thieves when it's supposed to be a house of prayer. It no longer has that identity. So this is the temple proper. This is supposed to be a place of worship. But you have all of this distraction and interference from the business that's being done. And Israel has a bad habit of this, as can be seen in the Old Testament. The Sabbath day is supposed to be a day of rest. You're not involved in any type of work. You're not involved in any type of commerce. But they started abusing that. And they started treating it just as another day. To where the Israelites had to make a law, and rightfully so, okay, the gates are going to be shut on the Sabbath day, so that none of this commerce is going on. Making it a place to make money and not for worshiping God. That's what the Sabbath day was. This is a day of rest. But now it's just another day of business. And that's not what we're supposed to be doing with this. And this action, these things are happening in the very heart of their religious system. Inside of the temple. And thus the danger to lose the real meaning of worshiping God. And it's like what Reese mentioned last week as we were preparing to partake of the Lord's Supper. What we're doing here can become simply ritual. It's just habit. It's an obligation, a custom. We're going through the motions. Something that we just have to do because God has commanded us to do it. And if that ends up happening to us, then what we're doing here today means nothing. We're not using this time and this assembly for what it is that it's supposed to be. And that as we are considering this topic and what Jesus is doing here at their time of worship, we should be asking ourselves the same question. What would happen to our assembly if Jesus were to walk through that door? In seeing what we're doing, knowing our hearts, knowing our thoughts, and about why we're here, what would his reaction be? Would he come in and find, like with what he said with Nathanael, here is a true Israelite in whom is no guile, and that he would sit down with us and worship with us? Or would he come in finding us in the state that Israel is right now and start overturning what we're doing? Start driving us out. These are things we need to consider. If it's the case then it'd be the case now. The same danger is there. We do not need to let these assemblies become corrupted to our own desires. Well, it's just something that we do. I come in, I get my pat on the head, and then I go home. I come in, eat my chip, take my sip, and leave my $2 tip, and then go out and live however I want to live. That's not what this is. And that's not what was supposed to be going on here. All of the things that are wrapped around the temple at this time and the worship that's being done is to impress upon the people's minds their need of God. And can you imagine, just put yourself here, you've traveled all this distance and then you run into that kind of stuff before you can enter into the house of God. That would be discouraging, that would be irritating, whatever other adjectives, adverbs, whatever those are, you want to tack onto them. But yet we are finding the great desire that true worshipers of God have in being faithful. That even with all of that nonsense going on, they did not let that stop them from worshiping God like they needed to. Well, if this is the kind of stuff they're going to be doing here, I'm just going home. That's the wrong attitude. And even as we're considering what Jesus is doing here and standing up to this, they should have already been standing up to this before Jesus even got here. The Levites, the priests, they knew this wasn't right. Why didn't they stand up to it? Pharisees, Sadducees, of course they're in on it, so it's understandable why they're not going to stand up to it. But what about everybody else? They should have stood up to it too. Called them out. And them been involved and running the money changers out. Yes?
I was just going to make a comment you brought up. Eli's sons and how they were perverting with their hook. And when you read the text, as we were studying it, it shows that even people were
Yep.
saying things about it at that time. So people were saying things and knowing that that was wrong at that time, even though nothing, Eli didn't stand up and stop them from doing it, which is, part of his
Yep.
condemnation from God. But it shows the contrast that the people were saying that they're not saying it now.
Right, right. And even then, it could be the case that they are saying it amongst themselves. But what's that doing? Nothing.
Causes more anger.
Right, it causes more anger, bitterness inside of whoever you're talking to about it, when you should be acting on it.
Well, if they were, that would be a point that you would think, not that I can say what's on God's mind, but that would be a point that God would bring up, like he did in Samuel, where it's talking about the people there.
Yeah.
But he doesn't. They're not confronting them
Mm-hmm.
for us to see that.
Right, right. Yeah, I understand what you're saying. So with all of that working together, it's going back to the point that we've made, several times about times change but people don't. And that the very things that you find going on inside of this system, God's system here, same thing takes place in God's system today. There are congregations of the Lord's church that are full of corruption. And that there's brethren there that know it. Why aren't you doing something about it? Why aren't you standing up to it? Well, the elders. If the elders aren't doing it, then we need to have a different conversation. If the elders are not taking charge and watching over the flock to deal with corruption, they have no business being in that position. You need new elders. The deacons, for that matter. If the deacons are not involved in stepping up and pointing these things out, you need a change in deacons. If you have an evangelist or a preacher, and he's not standing against these things, you might need to go on a new hunt. And for a preacher or an eldership to stand up and say, well, I've taught on it. If you're teaching on it and nothing has transpired, your teaching is not doing any good. The next step is confronting it. Deal with the issue. Otherwise, it's just going to spread like this is going to spread. But everybody, when it comes to leadership, nobody wants to take responsibility. Everybody wants to pass the buck. But what are we supposed to do about it? Do something. Well, what if they kick us out? Guess what? That's coming anyways. You're going to follow Jesus, they're going to kick you out for that. If you're going to suffer, suffer for doing what's right. Yes, Jamie.
This is just more about life experience, just pointing out that coming from, as you know, our journey, I wonder a lot of times what people really think about their role in Christianity inside the brotherhood.
Yeah.
And we're talking about bench warming. And that is a lot of what we have seen. We have been participants of bench warming and not understanding our own role
Yeah.
inside Christianity to understand, especially when we went through our Matthew study, when it says, no, he's not talking about some obscure Christians, he's talking about you.
Yeah.
And understanding where that is and where you are in that and where your responsibility lies.
Yeah.
And that's why those situations arise, because it's my personal belief that people don't understand. It's the floofy, and like you say, well, if the preacher is saying, I'm preaching on it and it's not getting through, then something else needs to happen.
Yeah. Some other tool from our toolbox that we have, which would be the Matthew 18, 1 Corinthians 5, and addressing the problems, you go handle it. You confront it. You tell them their fault. Tell them their trespass. If they hear you and they repent, good. If they don't, here are the steps that you need to go through. And if they don't hear that, withdraw. In hopes that that will shake them and wake them up to the reality of this is how bad what you're doing is. That we've had to go to this step. And that all of this, so even as we're thinking about the Levites and the priests, Pharisees, Sadducees, under the Jewish system, it's no different, as you're mentioning, it's no different than what we're looking at in the New Testament as Jesus is described teaching it in Matthew, as it's going to be described here in John, and then even as Paul picks it up later in his epistles and writing to brethren, we're all servants together. Well, if we're all servants together, and the literal word is slaves together, we're all on the same level. We're all servants, we're all brethren. So what about this position of leadership that you have? Does that put you above making a mistake? Does that put you above being corrected? Does that put you above having me look into what you're doing? No, it doesn't. Go ahead.
I think that goes back to Matthew 5:3, understanding where you stand in the sight of God, and when people really, really are not there because they, quote, become converted, but the change really never takes place. I was talking to Jordan this morning about various Christians that we have seen in our life in the Polson area.
Yeah.
And just how that, which was a lot of Adrian's family,
Yeah.
and just how the Christianity that took place was never a conversion process. It was what it is, and you've heard the stories and everything. And then you see that, we have seen that, and I'm kind of losing my thought, but there are not leaders to show. And when people aren't at the Matthew 5:3 point and they still have the pride, they have not put away those things to become that slave, to become the workers together. That's the problem. That's the
Yeah.
That's the root of it.
We just need to get you and Mom on a podcast.
All right, yeah,
Sorry.
we'll start our own broadcast, yeah. But no, that's right. And that when it comes to, as we're discussing about Christianity and the conversion process, the same thing is needing to happen so as to have good leaders. Leadership is not just something that you're born with. Now, there are some that's, okay, yeah, they've got the characteristics, the
Adam's apple.
just the makeup, the personality to kind of do that. But even then, leadership is something that has to be grown. Anybody can become a leader if you'll take on the characteristics that a leader is supposed to have. And what that is what we have seen or mentioned with our studies of Moses, Jesus definitely, and the other apostles, and what they're having to learn is a good leader is not a manager. That's not what a leader is. A manager or a leader is not one that's just sitting up there giving out commands and dictating, hey, you go do this, you go do that, you go do this. What you see with Moses, and especially with Jesus, is he's right down there involved in the work. He's not just telling them how to do it, he's showing them how to do it. And that's what's lacking with a lot of our leadership in the church. They're not showing anything. They just want to sit back and tell you what to do. That's not biblical leadership. And then you try to dig in and start trying to peek into what they're doing, and they want to beat you back with an authority stick. Well, this is the eldership, this, that, and the other. You're not above questioning. And you're not above removal either, if your leadership isn't fitting. But that's the struggle that we're all in as we're dealing with people that are in different positions of power, and especially as they gather more people around them. You get to a point where it feels helpless. It's useless. What are we supposed to do? These are the ones in charge. Doesn't matter. You make a stink. You tell somebody. And like if we're thinking about this from the standpoint of, here we are at Passover, and there are millions of Jews coming in so as to worship. What do you think would happen if those millions of Jews all stood collectively together and said, we're not doing this. We're not giving you our money. We're not going through this process until you stop doing these things. Things would change quick. And especially with the Levites. Because the Levites depend 100% on that temple tax. They have no land. They have no inheritance. That is how they survive. And the people stand up and they say, you are behaving corruptly. You are behaving unscripturally. We're not putting up with this. Then okay, they would need to change. But that process has to start somewhere. And it's starting here with Jesus. Let's move a little bit further. So here's the perversion of worship, and that ended up perverting how they lived. That they would devour widows' houses. That when it came to their tithes, they are tithing down to the minutest detail, but then they're leaving out justice. They're leaving out mercy. They're leaving out faith. The temple became nothing to them. And their everyday lives showed that. Now, as we're thinking about this from the New Testament perspective, the gospel is intended to change our lives also. And worship that is in line with the gospel is supposed to change our lives. And when worldliness is allowed to pervert the Bible and pervert worship, then worldliness is going to pervert us. And so much of what is done today in so-called worship to God is not in line with the Scriptures. You hop online and you watch any denominational service today that's being live streamed or recorded, and just take note of all the different things that they're doing that are not in line with what God has said to do. And then you start looking at their daily lives. And how much of their life is being involved in living in ways that God's Bible, God's Word says they're not supposed to live. And it's because it starts with the worship. If I can start changing the way that God says that I'm supposed to worship, then why can't I start changing how God says I'm supposed to live every day? There's a lot of perversion taking place. There's a lot of perversion in people's lives, even our own brethren. And why is it? Because they're not viewing the assembly as they should. This time for us coming together is to be a reminder of the importance of purity in our lives. Holiness. Well, if that's what's being focused on today, what should I be focused on tomorrow? Purity and holiness. Tuesday, Wednesday. What am I supposed to be thinking about? How am I supposed to be living? I'm supposed to be living as I would worship. But again, most of our brethren and most people, it's just, no, this is just something that we do. You know, if I don't attend the assembly, well, I'll be looked at funny. People look at me sideways. That's not a proper motivation. I'll be viewed less in their eyes. No, that's not why we're coming. I am coming for all of the spiritual benefits that God's Word and God's time of worship is supposed to have for me, so that I can make it through another week. We start messing with that, we start perverting that, and we start losing sight of that, then we're not going to see the kind of changes that we need. And that's what that's what He's changing here. And He's dealing with it in a very real way. So now, we have both sides of Jesus being presented in this chapter. Now, what do I mean by that? By saying both sides. And it's not just both sides of Jesus. Jesus is deity. He's God. So we're being shown both sides of God in this chapter. So what is this both sides business?
Only thing I can think of is the first part of it, He's taking care of the people in the sense of, as people would see, it's a good thing, but in the second half, other people would think that, well, this is not a good thing because he's flipping, he's getting mad, and he's chasing people out. And that's ultimately that's being thrown in our faces is, well, you're chasing people away, and that's a bad thing. So, but Jesus is doing this right here. He's chasing the people out because they're dishonoring God and dishonoring the Jews that are coming from miles and miles away.
Mm-hmm.
So there's two sides right there where He's doing miracles and He's helping, but He's also helping in this case, but He's showing it different. I can get angry too. I can get mad and chase you out.
Okay. And that's it. When people try to present Jesus and they say, in your teaching and preaching, you need to present Him in a certain way, And when it comes to his behavior, it's only one side. It's the beginning of chapter 2. Oh, well, they don't have wine. He's providing for them, turning water into wine. And that's true. And that's the compassion and that's the grace element. But there's another side to God. And John is giving us that full picture here. Yes, he is making provisions for man's needs, but he's also involved in making sure that those that are walking disorderly are being dealt with. And so I want to make sure I give credit to the artist here. I didn't draw this. This is Steve Thomason on his website. I didn't read the article. I just wanted the picture. But this is the scene. And even going back to our beginning screen, I have it kind of blurred just because I don't want people to focus in on skin color and tone and such as that. But this is chaos that we have pictured here. Jesus coming in, flipping tables. You got birds flying loose. You got animals running around. Money's rolling around on the floor. He's made a scourge of cords. You can guarantee he's hitting something with it. People would look at this and say, oh, no, that's so disruptive. That's chaotic. You don't need to be doing that. Maybe not at first. But this is the level that we've reached. And sometimes this is what it takes. And especially when you're with how God feels about widows and orphans. You do not abuse those two classes of people. And that's what they're doing. God takes that seriously. And here we have it being pictured. He is causing a storm inside of the place of worship, and it's because it's no longer a place of worship. And everything that's being done here is being done consciously. Jesus is entering in with full consciousness of his sonship and his ownership to that house. My Father's house. He's put himself on the same plane with God. There's the Father, there's the Son. If it's the Father's house, whose house is it also? It's the Son's house. And here is Jesus, and he's coming along cleaning house. We are not going to have time to get into Psalm 69, but I want to jump ahead very quickly, and we're going to deal with this term zeal and what it means, the breakdown of it, because it's going to come into play. But I want to close with this. Brethren, this is how Jesus begins his public ministry. Now, with the marriage feast of Canaan, there's a little bit of publicity. But what he did there was just with the servants. But as far as Jesus coming on the scene and his first act as the Son of God that the majority of people are going to see is him flipping tables. What do we think about that? It's what a lot of brethren today would say. Oh, Jesus, you don't need to start like that. Jesus, that's too harsh. Jesus, you need to have more tact. If you want to try to present that, go for it. But if we're taking seriously what it is that we're dealing with, and that we're dealing with false teachers promoting false doctrine that is going to cause souls to be lost, I think there needs to be some zeal in what we're doing. There needs to be some urgency. I'm not saying that this is the only way to do it, but I'm saying this is an option. And especially with whom it is that Jesus is dealing with. Who's he dealing with?
Those in charge.
Okay, those in charge. But are they out in the world?
God's house.
This is God's house. We're dealing with children of God. We are dealing with brethren. This is a part of it. And is this how we would view success coming in? Now, as somebody mentioned, as in dealing with the wedding feast in Cana, he's helping people. Yeah, so it was Reese. Jesus is helping people here too. I'm sure the Pharisees, Sadducees are not happy with this. But who cares? You're the one in sin. You're the one that's involved in this corruption. But who is going to love this? The poor people. Your everyday people that are coming into this system and being abused. They are the ones that are going to be cheering and that are going to be saying, "Thank God that you're here." And you have this kind of corruption, you have this kind of manipulation going on in religion. People see it. And just as Jamie mentioned under the Old Testament system, more than likely they're talking about it. Yeah, this is wrong. Something needs to be done about it. And very likely they are just waiting for somebody to come and take charge. That's where we step in. You know what? I'm willing to come in and to challenge what's being taught. I'm willing to confront false brethren on their doctrinal points. And I'm willing to do it with zeal and conviction. When most of our brotherhood looks at Jesus, they have taken in hook, line, and sinker the denominational view of how Christianity is supposed to be. And that if you were to be involved in things like this, to have this kind of attitude, characteristic about what you're doing, they would try to beat you down. And they have no right to. Here it begins in the temple in the heart of the nation, and the perversion of the temple was from the perversion of the hearts of God's people. And what's happening here? The Jewish leaders would never get over it. This is what sets the stage for the Pharisees, Sadducees, the high priest to start taking counsel on how they're going to kill him. Well, you see there, Jesus, you shouldn't have done that because now that's caused them to act this way. We don't get to reason that way. We do not do right or do not do right based upon how it's going to make somebody feel or how it might cause them to react. This is what needed to be done, and it should have been done long ago. And if that's the kind of attitude that's going to produce, then we see another problem with the leadership. It's not a problem with Jesus, there's a problem with you guys. But you see, even our own brethren, we are constantly in the business of trying to protect the one in sin. We're trying to protect the criminal. And we see that going on in our society. All of these people that should be persecuted for crimes that they're committing, and they're being set free. Now, most of our brethren would look at that and say, well, that's disgusting. They broke the law, they should be punished. I agree. Well, guess what? We got this brother over here, and he's walking disorderly, and he won't repent. He should be punished. Well, now we can't be too hasty. Is it criminal or not? Is it sin or not? And we see it in our society. The longer you go without handling it, what happens? The worse it gets. The more it escalates. And with what is happening here with Jesus, it had reached a boiling point. The people should never have allowed it to get there. But it did. All right, gloves are off. The Jews will never get over this. They'll even lie about what is about to transpire, or what is transpiring, so as to cover their sins. And they will use what Jesus is going to say next in this very chapter about destroying the temple, and they will lie about that too. They will misrepresent what Jesus says to make a false accusation against him in his trial before his death. And this is all religious people. These are his brethren. That just shows how bad sin is. And instead of correcting it, trying to cover up the links people will go to.
I would just say, with regard to when you're saying, look at what the people allowed to happen, the one scripture that comes to mind is, my people are destroyed for lack of knowledge.
Okay.
Just as a
Hosea.
summary.
Jesus says it's better to pluck out your eye, chop off your hand, and go through life like that.
Maimed, yeah.
Yeah, than to go into hell and burn for all eternity. And Jesus gives that time, okay? When you've fallen into a trap, you better pluck it out, better do this.
Yep.
I'm going to do it for you. Right here is an example of setting it up to where if you don't stop what you're doing, somebody else is going to have to come in and make a scene, and it's going to embarrass you, it's going to make you feel foolish. But like we're saying, rightfully so, because you're the one found in this trespass.
Yeah.
So, what I was thinking.
Yeah. And that it should have caused these people to change. But we know that it doesn't. Does not. How do we know that?
Because it happened again.
Because it happens again. Here we are at the beginning of Jesus' ministry, and he's cleaning out the temple. Matthew 21. We're coming to the close of Jesus' work. And what is he still having to do?
Flip tables.
Flip tables. People just will not learn. And that's just how deep the corruption goes. But this is even what Malachi foresaw. So this is where we'll close. We'll make sure we get this prophecy in there with what's happening. The Pharisees and Sadducees and the high priests, they cannot get angry with what Jesus is doing, because when it comes to messianic prophecies, this was actually foretold of what Jesus would do. Malachi 3 and verse 1, Behold, I will send my messenger, and he shall prepare the way before me. And the Lord whom ye seek shall suddenly come to his temple. Notice, his temple belongs to him. Even the messenger of the covenant, whom ye delight in, behold, he shall come, saith the Lord of hosts. They delight in him. They're waiting for this. They're looking forward to his appearing. But look at what he's going to do. But who may abide in the day of his coming? Uh-oh. This is taking a turn. And who shall stand when he appeareth? For he is like a refiner's fire, and like fuller's soap. And he shall sit as a refiner and purifier of silver, and he shall purify the sons of Levi. This is one of the jobs of the Messiah, is to purify Levi. What does that imply? What are we to infer from this? You're unclean. What are you going to say?
Well, not just that, but since the Levites were the priests, they're the ones who are practicing the law for the people to see, and they serve as the example.
That's right. Here's your leadership. Here's the one setting out what's holy and unholy, clean and unclean. And then there's somebody stepping in above them, needing to purify them. You're going to be perverted. But all of this is not a message of doom. It's a message of redemption. You are being cleansed. But what if I don't want to be cleansed? What if I'm not wanting to be purified in this fire? And there's that imagery. You're being purified with fire, not softness, not gentleness. We're not taking you in the hand. We're just kind of polishing you up a little bit. We are throwing you in the furnace. That's dramatic. It's chaotic. That's intense. But Jesus, they're being presented with, this is what you need. Purifier of silver, and he shall purify the sons of Levi, and purge them as gold and silver, that they may offer unto the Lord an offering in righteousness. This is what is necessary if you're going to worship God properly. He was come to bring everything back as it was supposed to be. So the very fact that Jesus is showing up on the scene like this, and he's involved in these kind of actions, what do the priests know about themselves? The prophecy is coming true. This is me. I need to be cleansed. But I'm a Jew. I'm a child of Abraham. I'm not needing to be cleansed. Who are you to come and cleanse me? All of this starts coming into play. Instead of having that humility and recognition of what's taking place, I'm just a servant here. I'm just a steward in God's house, and now God is here in His house. And how do they behave? They let it go to their head. Here he is to remove corruption. Then shall the offering of Judah and Jerusalem be pleasant unto the Lord, as in the days of old, as in former years. And I will come near to you in judgment, and I will be a swift witness against the sorcerers, and against the adulterers, and against false swearers, against those that oppress the hireling in his wages, the widow, the fatherless, that turn aside the stranger from his right, and fear not me, saith the Lord of hosts. So Jamie, I would add this list to what's being discussed in this chapter as to cross-references and proofs of what's going on in the lives of the leadership. For I am the Lord, I change not. Therefore, ye sons, and there's a reason why he uses this name, ye sons of Jacob, are not consumed. Jacob's name was changed to Israel. But Malachi does not call them the sons of Israel. He calls them the sons of Jacob. Deceiver. Usurper. All of that is done on purpose to show to them, to establish in their minds just how deep the corruption was. And that Malachi is writing about this as being the time that the Messiah is going to come. So what does that say about the state of Israel when Jesus shows up? What is he dealing with? This is what he's dealing with. And thus explains part of his actions, part of his behavior. Here we are, and we're dealing with those that are wanting to be leaders. Okay? You want to be a leader? You're going to be dealt with a certain way. Pharisees, Sadducees, they get handled differently than, for example, the rich young ruler. Nicodemus, he gets handled differently. But it's in the same vein with what's happening here. He's a leader and he's a teacher in Israel. And Jesus does not pull any punches with Nicodemus. He jumps right in with him. And he even makes accusation against Nicodemus. You claim to be a teacher in Israel and you don't know these things? You don't think that hurt Nicodemus? Shouldn't really, if you're recognizing who you're dealing with.
But eventually he did,
But eventually he did.
because his heart was right.
That's
and he
right.
accepted it.
Good soil.
And he converted.
Good soil. And I would argue, with everything that we have going on today in our society, a lot of people are ready for this. You just look at the unruliness and the unrest that's going on in our country and in our local communities, and people are looking at leadership and they are saying, why aren't you doing something about this? And that they're ready for somebody or a group of somebodies who will step in and mind the gap and say, yeah, we're going to do something about this. And even if it makes this section of the community mad, I'm not going to worry about that. Because the reason why it's making them mad is because they're in sin. What they're doing is wrong. And that's where John 3 is going to come into play. Those that are in darkness hate the light, because the light shines on darkness and shows that their deeds are evil. I can't help that. So when we're thinking about these two things being together, we need to take it into that context. Is God full of grace? Is God full of compassion? Yes, He is. But what this teaches us is when grace is rejected, when you will not believe on what God says that you're needing to believe, the only thing that's left is judgment. And even with what Jesus is doing here, this is an attempt to get Israel to change. Well, if you did that to me, I wouldn't change. Well, you've got a problem. Is what Jesus is doing here in any way comparison to what's going to happen to Israel when Rome comes? You think this is bad? Oh, Jesus, you flipped our tables. Rome is going to surround you and enclose you to where you're going to end up eating your own children. Which one would you rather have? I'd rather have this than to have the other. But it's just when people are in sin, they don't want to recognize the actions being what they're for. What they had done to God's house was so disgusting that God got angry. And He took action. But again, we have the balance being presented in the chapter. Is there grace and compassion? Yes, there is grace and compassion. Is there zeal, indignation, anger when dealing with sin? Absolutely. Because of what sin does. How sin corrupts and how sin abuses. So we'll do a little bit more on that next week and looking at Psalm 69, verse 9, but we're going to look at the context of what's transpiring here, being written about, looking at the words, making some more connection before moving on. Verse 15 or not 15, but 18, and the response that they have for him. So any thoughts, questions?
Your picture with all the first picture you used,
Yep.
I just thought it was funny because it looks like the doves are attacking.
So going back to the Gospel of Thomas. All right. Nothing else. We'll stop there.